Hello and welcome to The Curator on Monocle Radio with me, Carlotta Rebello. Over the next 60 minutes, we'll be bringing you some of the very best interviews and reports from the past week of coverage on Monocle Radio, with highlights from our studios here at Midori House in London and also from around the world. This week, Monocle's Andrew Muller asks, why is Donald Trump running Venezuela?
So when considering the most obvious questions raised, why do this, why now, and what happens next, it is entirely possible that the answers, so far as Trump is concerned, are respectively, because I felt like it, because I could, and I don't care.
Plus, we hear from a hotel industry heavyweight who's continuing to rewrite the rules of luxury hospitality.
What the customer wants today, particularly in the last 5 years, 7 years, they want personality, they want individuality. They need storytelling, they need narrative.
All that and much, much more over the next hour here on The Curator with me, Carlotta Rebello. We begin this week's show with a look back to Wednesday's edition of the Foreign Desk Explainer. Donald Trump has pledged to run Venezuela after U.S. forces captured its leader Nicolás Maduro last weekend. So, is this the beginning of a tripolar world between the U.S., China and Russia? And should Greenland, Cuba and Colombia be on the edge? Monocle's Andrew Muller explains.
My fellow citizens, at this hour, American and coalition forces are in the early stages of military operations to disarm Iraq, to free its people, and to defend the world from grave danger.
Donald Trump is not the first US president whose declared reasons for doing a particular thing may be different from their actual reasons for doing a particular thing. Donald Trump is, however, the first US president of whom it is an open question as to whether he is himself entirely certain why he has embarked upon a given course. Trump is, in politics as in person, a creature of unrestrained id, volatile whim, and extraordinary capacity for grudge-bearing.
All Venezuelan military capacities were rendered powerless as the men and women of our military, working with U.S. law enforcement, successfully captured Maduro in the dead of night. It was dark.
An undervalued motivation for the weekend's raid on Venezuela, which captured President Nicolás Maduro, now supping the gruel of the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn, is that Venezuela has long loomed large in Trump's perfervid fantasies of a plot to steal from him the 2020 US presidential election. Late last year, it was plausibly reported that US federal investigators had been instructed to pursue the entirely unevidenced and flatly risible suggestion that Venezuela, a country which can barely keep its own lights on, had somehow tweaked American voting machines in 2020, though presumably decided they couldn't be bothered in 2024. Trump has recently amplified at least one podcast elaborating upon this nonsense.
This is the largest transnational criminal organization in the world that no one knew about or no one wanted to talk about until they stole our election in 2020 and we decided, okay, you want to play hardball? Here we come.
So when considering the most obvious questions raised by Operation Absolute Resolve, why do this, why now, and what happens next, it is entirely possible that the answers, so far as Trump is concerned, are respectively, because I felt like it, because I could, and I don't care. But with all due acknowledgement that Trump may have grown bored with the whole thing by this time next week, after all, who now recalls America's great crusade against Islamist militias in Nigeria, which lasted all of an hour and a quarter of Boxing Day?
We're going to do things to Nigeria that Nigeria is not going to be happy about.
It is worth pondering other possible motivations and consequences. The putative reasons and or legal covers for the seizing of Maduro are the US indictments issued against him some as long ago as 2020 on charges of running drugs and or guns. Maduro may well be guilty of these. He is a monstrous crook, was a dismal tyrant, and none of that is beyond him. But Trump's solemnly avowed ruthlessness towards drug kingpins is difficult to square with his pardoning last month of former President Juan Orlando Hernandez of Honduras, 18 months after a U.S. federal court sentenced him to 45 years for importing 400 tons of cocaine into the U.S. So, probably not the drugs? There is the unhappy possibility that the US has picked off a relatively easy target by way of rolling the pitch for further such endeavours. In the days since, Trump has mentioned Cuba, Mexico, Colombia and Greenland, and or ushering the world towards a tripolar arrangement in which the US, China and Russia are enjoined to do as they please, so long as they don't trouble each other. Back in 2019, Fiona Hill, an advisor on Russian matters to the US National Security Council during Trump's first term, testified to Congress that Russian President Vladimir Putin had proposed to Trump an effective swap of Venezuela for Ukraine. Or the intention may have been a swift, decisive strike against one adversary with the aim of putting others on notice. Operation Absolute Resolve took place on the 6th anniversary of the American drone strike in Baghdad, also authorized by Trump, which killed the Iranian general Qasem Soleimani, commander of the Quds Force of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. It is just about arguable that this was the beginning of the welcome unravelling of Iran's regional influence since then. It is difficult to make a case that Maduro was a menace of even vaguely comparable magnitude. There is, of course, Venezuela's oil, of which Trump has been unabashedly covetous.
Oil. What are we going to do with the oil that we have?
Going to do with what?
The oil that has been seized. The United States seized 1.9 million barrels of oil on December 10th.
We're going to keep it.
Where's it?
But if someone's oil is actually what you want, it is vastly cheaper and easier to buy it than steal it. Added to which, Venezuela's oil is more impressive for its quantity than its quality. While Venezuela's reserves are, by general consensus, the world's largest, the oil itself is heavy and gloopy and requires more processing than most. Establishing the infrastructure necessary to refine and transport it would take years and cost tens of billions, all at a time at which oil prices are low, and everybody, very much including energy companies, if not the US president, understands that fossil fuels are not the future. On top of which, anybody possessed of the wherewithal to invest that much is likely to want a more secure political environment than Venezuela may be able to offer, or the US willing to impose. So whatever President Trump may think, it probably isn't the oil itself, but it might be to stop anyone else having it. US Secretary of State Marco Rubio, currently also serving as the administration's voice of relative sanity, we must take what we can get, etc., has this week noted, correctly, that the US has all the oil it needs.
We don't need Venezuela's oil. We have plenty of oil in the United States.
However, Rubio elaborated that the US does not want Venezuela's oil controlled by China, Russia and or Iran.
Why does China need their oil? Why does Russia need their oil? Why does Iran need their oil?
Or any of those actually or potentially hostile countries having a base of operations in the United States' backyard. This is not in itself an ignoble aspiration, though possibly something more likely to be realized by the US regarding its neighbors as neighbors rather than pests, threats and nemeses. Amid the haphazard presidential press conference which followed the Venezuela raid, Trump invoked the Monroe Doctrine, the precept by which the fifth US president asserted American primacy over the entire Western Hemisphere, and under which the US has since staged dozens of overt and covert operations to remove or subvert inconvenient Latin American governments.
All the way back, it dated to the Monroe Doctrines. And the Monroe Doctrine is a big deal, but we've superseded it by a lot.
Although Trump being Trump, it may actually be as simple as the fact that some wags have begun referring to the Donroe Doctrine, a notion irresistible to someone who likes nothing better than having stuff named after him or similar glorifying blandishments. Maduro could have spared himself considerable headache for the price of a red, gold and blue sash with a brooch on it. For Monocle Radio, I'm Andrew Miller.
Venezuela wasn't the only country making the headlines this week. Leaders of some 35 countries from the Coalition of the Willing met in Paris on Tuesday to discuss how Ukraine could be secured after a ceasefire with Russia. The meeting was led by Emmanuel Macron and Keir Starmer, joined by Volodymyr Zelensky and senior US envoys Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff. It comes at an awkward moment, with Washington focus on Venezuela and relations with Europe strained by renewed tensions over Greenland. At the 15th meeting of the coalition, Britain and France signed a declaration of intent to send troops to Ukraine in the event of a peace deal. And on Wednesday's edition of The Globalist, Monocle's Georgina Godwin was joined from Studio 5 at Rue Boschemont in Paris by Francis Collings, the foreign news correspondent for the BBC and AP. Georgina began by asking Francis what some of the details are in the declaration.
It's complicated as ever with these things. A lot of the detail has yet to be ratified. The cost, they did stress that troops are not going to be sent on a combat basis, but more or less being put into military hubs, also reinforcing the Ukrainian armed forces. But we've also got to bear in mind, Georgina, this has got to go back to the respective countries. It's got to be ratified by parliaments in the UK, in Germany, Congress in the United States. As you mentioned, the US was there, not necessarily with any heavyweight government officials, but the representatives of Donald Trump and Stephen Witkoff and Jared Kushner. And the concern, I guess, is always how much of a backing are they going to get from the United States? Will things change on a dime? But it is a step forward in terms of deploying troops, establishing military hubs, but all, of course, dependent on a ceasefire with Russia. And bearing in mind, Vladimir Putin has stated categorically all the way through he would not accept NATO troops close to the Russian border on Ukrainian soil.
You talk about Witkoff and Kushner there. What do they say that the United States is prepared to do?
Well, they say that they stand firmly behind the guarantees that have been agreed, and these are guarantees designed to prevent any further aggression. Certainly in terms of keeping something of a beady eye on Russian forces, they can provide technology. Boots on the ground from the United States is something which, of course, President Trump is not willing to commit or talk about. But we have to start thinking about, well, can this go ahead if the United States do actually change their mind, or they are less willing, even though they are part of the coalition of the willing? And also, does Europe have to really start firming its act, stepping things up, bearing in mind they're not entirely sure what support is coming from NATO, whether there will be a NATO in a few months, and what President Trump is going to do over the thorny issue of things like Greenland, which he keeps talking about.
And of course, this is the elephant in the room, because it makes one wonder how significant the declaration is because of what Trump is saying over Greenland, which is, of course, a NATO ally. So is Europe preparing itself to perhaps act without the US?
Well, I don't think they want to go that far, and I don't think anyone is going to be willing to talk about that. I mean, we see, and I'm sure you've seen in the UK, the squirming by the UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer whenever he's asked questions about this. You have people who obviously have a duty to their own country while also trying to maintain a good relationship with President Trump and, of course, with the United States. And someone was talking recently, and I heard them mention that it's almost a holding pattern. Yes, Ukraine has to be sorted out as soon as possible, but this White House may not be there for the long term. There's 3 years to go on this term, of course. And also we have to ask, are we looking at the future of NATO perhaps hinging on what comes out of the Epstein files? Are we seeing a wag the dog scenario? If you recall that great film from the 90s about America declaring war to distract from presidential problems? And also, what is going to happen next week?
Yeah,
this is unprecedented, it seems, in world politics, certainly in our time. You always at least knew where America stood. We're not entirely sure now.
Just focusing back in on, should this all go well, should there be a ceasefire, which is extremely unlikely at this point, it has to be said, how would a European-led multinational force operate on Ukrainian soil?
Well, it's military hubs as well as hardware, so it's going to be bases, effectively. I don't think if we're looking for a comparison, it can be quite the same with what happened in West Germany post-World War II. But establishment of secure hubs that can monitor Russian forces. And we're not talking, it seems, in the short term. We're not just talking about ending the conflict in the short term. These are troops that want to be there, according to this agreement, according to what they say. They haven't said how many troops, and they haven't spoken about cost, but to be there for the long term to prevent any resurgence of any aggression from Russia, any reattempt to invade. So it's basically military hubs, hardware expertise, and American security guarantees in terms of keeping an eye on Russians, is how I seem to read it after looking at the press conference yesterday.
What has Vladimir Zelensky said?
Well, I mean, you have to, feel for Vladimir Zelensky, who seems to spend most of his time in the air, rushing around to various meetings, and I think he was in Florida a few days ago. He's always very grateful. He's always, I think, since he got very badly burned in February at the White House in that horrible scenario with Trump and his advisors, he's always saying how grateful he is. But he has had backing and support, certainly from Britain, France and Germany all the way through. He can count on their support. And they, of course, are placing themselves very much as mitigators when it comes to the Americans as well. Starmer, as we know from the UK, works very hard on his relationship with Trump, as does Emmanuel Macron, who invited Trump, if you remember, to the opening Notre Dame here in Paris before he was even starting as president for the second time. So the support is there from Europe, but we have to consider we may be looking at a new world order over the next few years where NATO could dissipate if something happens, if not Greenland, something else. Trump, when he was on the stump, of course, said, I think when he was just talking, and he does say a lot of things on his rallies. Well, I could encourage Putin to invade a country in Europe. Well, what if Putin is encouraged to invade a Latvia, or an Estonia? What does NATO do then? Does it have American backing? Are we going to see the formation of a European-based NATO going over the next few years? And is there any concrete ability to do that?
The foreign news correspondent Francis Collings there in conversation with Monocle's Georgina Godwin earlier this week from our studio in Paris. You're listening to The Curator on Monocle Radio with me, Carlotta Rebello. The growing rivalry between China and the US is a story of one nation catching up with the other, a Western power that once built gleaming highways and was the king of manufacturing, now a nation of bureaucracy and lawyers that is slowly becoming eclipsed by an Asian power full of the next generation of engineers and technocrats. At least that's the story told by Dan Wang, technology author and a Canadian who's lived in both the US and China and who recently wrote the book Breakneck, China's Quest to Engineer the Future. Monocle's Chris Chermak spoke with Dan recently here at Midori House and began by asking him whether there was something different about China that will lead it to remain a nation of engineers even as it becomes a developed economy like the United States.
I understand China in part as an engineering state because it has engaged in these vast spasms of construction over the last few decades, building so many highways, railways, solar, wind, nuclear, all sorts of new homes, all sorts of big projects. And this is something that the United States used to build. So in this 100-year period between roughly the middle of the 19th century to the middle of the 20th century, the U.S. built a lot of major infrastructure. It built the Manhattan Project. It built the Apollo missions. And then it mostly stopped throughout the 1960s and the 1970s. And I think that China will at some point have to stop building a lot of its highways. It already has more than twice as much highways as the U.S. It has something like 2/3 of the world's clean energy projects under construction. It has a much, much more high-speed rail than the rest of the world put together. And so at some point, it's got to stop building all of this infrastructure, especially since the population is already in decline. But I think that there is something unique about China relative to other East Asian countries even, in which the regime really derives a lot of its non-democratic legitimacy from delivering big projects for the people because it feels monumentalist and it feels like a major prestige project in order to have people do all of these big things.
Is there a benefit to being an engineering country now compared to 50 years ago? That's one thing I also wonder reading your book, because you talk about technological prowess, where we've arrived at now compared to 50 years ago. AI, everything that comes into that, is that a benefit or a curse that this is the moment that China are the engineers compared to the US 50 years ago?
In part a curse, but I would understand it mostly as a benefit, that China right now is still connecting a lot of villages to bigger cities as well as to bigger markets, that they are able to very plausibly deliver what the people want in terms of if you're living in urban areas, more parks, more subway connections. And China brings all sorts of advantages to artificial intelligence. So if the AI is going to be everywhere, it's going to be in our roads, in our cars, in my coffee, then we're going to use a lot more power throughout the entire process. And China is really building a lot of power. This year, China will build about 300 gigawatts of solar power. The U.S. will build about 30, so that's a 10 times difference. China right now has 33 nuclear power plants under construction. The U.S. has 0. And so there's all sorts of advantages that if the technologies of the present, if we like them and if we want more of it, and a lot of this demands more infrastructure, then it is a good thing to have more infrastructure in place, especially if there's a lot of housing unaffordability in places like New York and London, where we're chatting from now.
On the economics, what I find interesting is there's really two sides to it and contradictions through this book when you look at China. On the one hand, you talk about its ability to build things, the resilience that's in there, the fact that they focus on shock buffers and building up rations, food security, energy security, all of that. But at other times, this book reads like China is on the brink of a massive financial crisis because of overbuilding and all of these other aspects, which just leads me to wonder, can it be both?
Yes. Many things are both. And I think that this is always one of these big things that when we think about China, I think we have to understand two central facts. The first is that it has achieved pretty astonishing economic growth, lifting about over 1 billion people out of poverty, a few 100 million people into the middle class, a few million people into the global elite. That is an achievement. At the same time, we have to understand that it has been engaged in all sorts of new and novel forms of repression, a highly repressive state in the 21st century. So I see political tightening as well as economic growth happening at the same time, that this is in parts contradictory. And so these things could happen all at the same time.
Now, to bring it to the U.S., because so much of your book is also focused on kind of comparing the two. Currently, Donald Trump wants to bring back manufacturing capacity in the U.S. He admires Xi's ability to get things done in this respect. Obviously, critics would say he leans towards autocracies with that. But it is very much a subject of your book, and there are positives to the ability for politicians and governments to get things done. And with that in mind, then, tell me about your impressions of what could be brought over to the U.S. Are there elements of the kind of central planning style of China that the U.S. could adopt without slipping into an autocracy?
I hope so. So I definitely see that Donald Trump is admiring Xi Jinping quite extensively. He has said something like, Xi Jinping is brilliant, nearly perfect. There's no one in Hollywood quite like this guy, implying as if Xi is Tom Cruise levels of handsome or something. It's a very odd thing for Donald Trump to say. And I've written a piece in The Economist to say that what the U.S. right now is getting is sort of authoritarianism without the good stuff, without the good stuff of orderly cities, without the good stuff of a vital manufacturing base, without the ability to build extensive public works. I don't think that the U.S. should become like China, to be very clear. I think that there are some things that the Chinese might be able to teach in terms of building high-speed rail at cost and without being something like 15 years later, as is the case in California. But for the most part, I think that the U.S. should look towards Europe as a place that has managed to build public works on the continent at pretty reasonable cost. It doesn't have to go fully Chinese, but there are still a couple of things that I think Americans ought to still be curious about with China.
That was Dan Wang, technology analyst and writer, speaking to Monocle's Chris Chermak earlier this week. Breakneck, China's Quest to Engineer the Future is out now. Next, we head to Bangkok to hear how renovations have stripped the city's robot building of its personality. For this week's edition of Tall Stories, Tomas Pinheiro explains how an act of urban erasure in the Thai capital stole the charm from one of the city's most iconic structures.
Amidst the growing number of glass towers, Bangkok still has a few standout characters on its skyline. There's a so-called elephant building, whose 3 towers and connecting cantilever form the silhouette of the animal, including a head with eyes, ears and tusks. There's the Pixel building, the tallest in town, which, despite its glass exterior, arranges terraces, skyboxes and stacked balconies in a pixelated cascade, as if digitally fragmenting before our eyes. And there was, until recently, the Robot building, a structure that once mirrored the boxy robots of the retro tech years. The Robot building boasted gridded windows that read as panels and screens, along with 2 antennas at the top, button-like bumps, and huge mechanical joints. Its anthropomorphic quality was most clear in the upper volume, where 2 round windows resembled eyes with heavy eyelids, giving the impression of a calm, slightly unimpressed machine that once kept watch over the city. Completed in 1986, this peculiar building was the work of celebrated architect Sumit Jumsai for the new headquarters of the Bank of Asia. The idea came to him as he sketched on a notepad while his son played nearby with a Japanese robot toy. Sumit initially sent the drawing to the client as a joke, but they liked what they saw. The building as a symbol of the automation trends shaping the banking industry in the 80s. To Jumsai, this was, in his words, a happy project, a robot that smiled at people who smiled back. It represented technology as a part of life, the robot as a friend. In the original plan, he even wanted a light show for the building's eyes, with the 2 circular windows winking at night and sending bright beams across the city. The building's eyes saw the development of the area. This was the first high-rise in the Sathorn district, a giant robot dominating the low-rise sprawl long before other high-rises took over the area. They also overlooked the arrival of the SkyTrain, which now cuts through Bangkok. For decades, kids glued themselves to the window to catch a glimpse of the robot as the train glided past, and a fair few adults did it too. Bangkok's robot gained recognition well beyond Thailand, appearing in everything from books and magazines to children's cartoons, in exhibitions around the world, and even in a History Channel episode of Modern Marvels. Deservedly so. The robot building was, after all, the forerunner of postmodern architecture in Asia, displaying the symbolism, imagination and humor that defined the style. Even with its playfulness, the building carried a certain elegance, a geometric clarity that gave it a charm only deepened with time. As tastes shifted, though, some began treating the robot building like last season's tech, waving it off as yesterday's novelty. In 2023, Singapore's UOB Bank, which had already taken over the building, announced remodeling plans. In the words of its president in Thailand, the remodel prioritized people's wellness and environmental sustainability. The new project introduced a complete reworking of the exterior, replacing the original facade with an all-glazed skin set to, and I quote again, reduce carbon emissions and promote eco-friendliness. The city, still healing from the loss of Scala Cinema, an Art Deco masterpiece razed to the ground to make space for a shopping mall, held its breath for another architectural tragedy. Meanwhile, Jumsai and preservation group Doko Momo sprung into action, urging the bank to reconsider. They argued for updating the interior while keeping the frame and the distinctive facade intact, since those carried architectural and cultural value. It made no difference. Today, as the train glides past, something remains. Another glass office tower. But something is missing too. Bangkok's robot has disappeared from the skyline. If you're curious about what the robot building once looked like, you can head to M+ Hong Kong, where they've assembled an archive of Jumsai's work, including models, drawings, sketches and photographs. The museum is becoming a repository of sorts for traces of how Asian cities looked in the past. It's there, alongside a preserved unit from Tokyo's dismantled Nakagin Capsule Tower and examples of Hong Kong's fading neon signage, that the robot building has found a more lasting corner, if only as a model.
Tomasz Pinheiro there with the latest edition of Tall Stories. Still to come here on The Curator, we hear from one of the most influential brand builders in global luxury hospitality, look forward to the return of an iconic film, and our Istanbul correspondent says goodbye to the city. Stay tuned.
Craft matters, in small ways, like how a coffee is brewed, and in not so small ways, like how your money is cared for, which is why for 160 years, UBS has elevated banking to a craft, tailoring unique strategies that combine human expertise with the latest technologies, all happening across 24 time zones and 12 key financial hubs, with you at the heart of it all. UBS, banking is our craft.
You're with The Curator, our weekly highlights show here on Monocle Radio. I'm Carlotta Rebello. Next, we turn to this week's edition of The Entrepreneurs. Neil Jacobs is a strategic advisor to the Capella Hotel Group and one of the most influential brand builders in global luxury hospitality. Formerly the CEO of Six Senses, Neil has spent decades shaping hotels with sustainability, well-being, and a deep sense of place at their core. Today, he also advises on new concepts through his venture, Wild Origins. Monocle's Emma Nelson caught up with Neil to discuss the changing expectations of luxury travellers, Capella's sister brand Patina, and the importance of imagination in modern hospitality. Emma began by asking him how sustainability can be really stitched into a hotel's culture rather than treated as a selling point.
Hotels are doing it better. As an industry, frankly, we have a shocking reputation with sustainable practice, and it's rarely part of the culture of larger organizations or any kind of group with some scale. You've got individual hotels out there that do it very well because they may be family-owned and people really care about it. But the bigger corporate groups, they're doing a bit of the data-driven stuff now, but on the ground, actually doing it, it's not a great reputation.
What does a customer want now, from looking back to the fairly large amount of shoe leather that you've worn out doing your job?
That's very polite.
What are you learning about how customers are changing and what clients want? And also what a hotel can offer that differentiates itself?
Well, therein lies the issue, right? I have my normal speech about the state of the luxury hotel business, which, you have the traditional luxury brands, all of whom are very good, and the food's good, the service is good, the bed's comfortable, and so on and so forth. But it's not enough, at that level of the market, that's a given, and yet people still want to talk about intuitive service. I mean, it's so boring, it's what the customer wants today, particularly in the last 5 years, 7 years. They want personality. They want individuality. They need storytelling. They need narrative, because you look at luxury today, it's kind of become homogenous. They're all the same. They're all pretty good, but they're all kind of the same. So the people that are, the groups and the hotels that are going to chip away and are chipping away that market share are these smaller, more, I hate the word, but it's kind of more personalized, more bespoke in some ways, that focus very much on environment and where you are and culture and context of the location of those hotels. And I give plenty of examples. I mean, we're opening...
Go on then, give some examples.
We're opening...
In Japan?
Yeah, in Japan. Kyoto will open. Well, we have a Patina in Osaka, which opened earlier this year. And in March, we'll be opening Capella in Kyoto. It's right next to a geisha school. So we have been on the ground there for 15 months, kind of digging around, and what are the activations? What are we going to be able to offer the guests that other hotels can't offer? You cannot access that geisha community. However, given that we're the neighbor and lots of talk and lots of invitations and so on, we've managed to gain access to the private tea rooms where The real geishas and the trainee geishas go and have their tea, and we have been allowed to access those units and bring our guests there and talk to the geishas and just like I mean, this is a big deal for Kyoto. The location is right in the heart of the old town. You know, geographically we're there. So it's things like that that kind of actually make the difference.
That was Neil Jacobs, strategic advisor to the Capella Hotel Group, in conversation with Monocle's Emma Nelson. Next to the latest installment of Monocle on Fashion. This week, the show's host, Natalie Theodosi, was joined in the studio by Monocle's culture editor, Sophie Monahan-Coombs, to discuss the cultural touchpoints to look out for in 2026, from fashion exhibitions and novels to the return of an iconic film.
I just couldn't help but pick this because it is almost 20 years after The Devil Wears Prada came out in 2006, which in itself is wild. And so I think it is pretty significant that it is coming back this year, the 1st of May. The Devil Wears Prada 2 will land. Everyone is back. The whole cast. We've got Meryl Streep, we've got Anne Hathaway, but also Emily Blunt and Stanley Tucci. And so far, there's just been this little teaser trailer released, which just shows Meryl Streep's character, Miranda Priestley, of course, kind of walking through the office, and then she has a moment in the lift with Anne Hathaway's character. So they're just kind of setting it up in this very light way. But do you know about the kind of online media storm?
I do.
About
That's
the
what
shoes?
I was gonna say.
Maybe you can talk
it
about
was
this
that
then.
very short clip, but it still created so much. I mean, controversy is a big word, but so many opinions online about her choice of shoes, just because those Valentino Rockstuds are quite old-fashioned. So the choice really got people riled up, which is just funny, I think.
Amazing.
But it goes to show how popular it is, and we're joking about it being a little bit more lowbrow, but it's such a big part of the zeitgeist. So it is a big deal that it's coming back, and I find it also quite interesting that it's coming back after a year of quite a lot of books, fictional and also memoirs, that have been talking about media, especially in New York, and really glamorizing the 90s and that good old age that everyone's who was lucky enough to live it, not us, sadly. And why do you think there's so much nostalgia around and so many books and now films coming out about golden age of Condé Nast, Graydon Carter, Vanity Fair? What is the appeal?
Yeah, it really, I think, for part of it is just that we've moved on so far. And I think now there's enough distance from that time to really appreciate what things were like and how much, the public were willing to pay for media, but also how much money was in it in general. And also, the role of kind of media institutions and print institutions as tastemakers, which, doesn't happen now because everyone has their own Instagram and, celebrities or kind of public figures have so much more control over their image. So I think it's that with enough distance we can see how much it's changed. And obviously it's a kind of lowbrow film, as we were saying, and it's about fashion, and it will show how fashion has changed. But I think it will be really interesting to see how they portray how journalism has changed, and whether this is a kind of hopeful story about the future of digital journalism, or if it just feels quite nostalgic, as the Graydon Carter and some of the other books that have come out this year, they really have that sort of nostalgic feel. So I'm really interested to see what they do with this one.
That was Monocle's culture editor, Sophie Monahan-Coombs, speaking to Natalie Theodosi, Monocle's fashion director. You're with The Curator, our weekly highlights show here on Monocle Radio. Next to The Urbanist, dotted around Britain and the rest of the world too, are a number of brutalist structures known as cooling towers. These relics of our 20th century industrial history, which were most commonly used in power plants, are largely redundant in today's industry, and as such are about to disappear for good. A beautiful book titled Cooling Towers was recently published by the 20th Century Society, which honors these vanishing sculptural giants through a collection of photographs and essays. And The Urbanist this week featured an interview with the book's editor, Ollie Marshall. Monocle's Andrew Tuck began by asking Ollie to explain to those uninitiated with industrial history what a so-called cooling tower actually is.
So cooling towers, or to give them their proper name, hyperboloid thermal towers, are enormous structures which act in industrial capacities to lower the temperature of water. So in post-war power stations, which is where a lot of the ones we're most excited are, they cooled the water which was passed through a boiler at very, very high temperatures, which literally turned the turbines which created power and electricity. They're also used in other capacities like chemical works or steel mills, but it's the power station ones that are really, really special. And these are, to give you your listeners a sense of scale, 350 to 400 foot high, some of these towers. And the concrete from which they're constructed is only 7 inches thick. So they're a real tour de force of engineering, the sort of poetry of applied mathematics in concrete.
If I was living not in the UK, if I was in Dortmund or in Barcelona, would these be part of my skyline heritage as well?
They would. They're not unique to the UK. The very earliest examples were developed in the 1920s in the Netherlands. It's something which is facing a lot of countries as they're reaching the end of their coal-fired or fossil fuel power, and a lot of these stations are being decommissioned. So if you look internationally, there are some really interesting examples of what you can do with a redundant cooling tower. But yeah, you'll see them across Europe and across the world.
I guess when people have seen them, when they've been active, you often see what looks like smoke billowing out of them. And we associate them with not having clean air, but is that just steam then coming out?
It is. It is water vapor, yeah. So again, you look at them and think they're churning out, pumping out smoke or steam into the atmosphere, but it is essentially water vapor from the cooling of the water that goes into the production of power.
You've made this book. You're concerned about their lack of presence maybe in the future on our skylines. Why do you like them?
Well, I think something we always point to is that the British countryside, the landscape, is littered with the power generation from previous centuries. So we could think of gas holder frames, gasometers, the chimneys from mills or factories, smock windmills, lime kilns. And these were essentially purely functional structures. But over time, they've gradually assumed the status of regional or national landmarks. And cooling towers are really just in the same tradition, if they get a chance. Anthony Gormley has called them man-made volcanoes or the Stonehenge of the Carbon Age. And as we're nearing the end of that Carbon Age, we need to try and preserve something, some memory, some legacy from that.
How did you go about producing the book then? Because you've got some interesting essayists to come on board, you've got various photographers. How did you put together this portfolio of these amazing cooling towers?
So the launch pad for the book project was an exhibition that we staged probably a couple of years ago now at Margaret Howell, the fashion retailer in London. And for that, we looked for a really varied and stimulating range of photographs. Now, there's obviously some exquisite archival photos of these towers in use over the past century. But as they are being decommissioned and demolished, there's also a kind of range of photographers that are documenting them before they go. So that combination of the old and the new, seeing them when they were initially commissioned and seeing them now towards the end of their life, is really compelling. It's really powerful. And equally, there's a lot of writers, poets, songwriters and lyricists who've woven cooling towers into their work and into their stories. We tried to feature a range of those as well.
Now, you were telling me before we quickly came on air that there is no kind of listing process for these. There's no one said, look, you can't destroy these. So they could all vanish.
They could. So our organisation, the 20th Century Society, has submitted several listing applications to Historic England and to DCMS, the government. At the moment, their policy is not to preserve or protect any of them, but it's just to have an extensive photographic record. And while some of those photos are exquisite, that's obviously no substitute for retaining some and keeping some. I mean, to give an idea of where we are, at their peak in the 1960s, there were around 250 individual cooling towers across the country. We're now down to 37 individual towers at about 8 sites, and we're losing them at about 6 or 8 a year to demolition. So by the end of this decade, they will all be gone.
Ollie Marshall, the campaign's director for the 20th Century Society, speaking to Monocle's editor-in-chief Andrew Tuck on The Urbanist. And finally on today's show, the Monocle Daily's weekly letter comes from Istanbul. Here's Monocle's departing correspondent from the Turkish city, Hannah Lucinda Smith.
It's a perfect December sunset over the Bosphorus, wisps of icy cloud reaching through pastel pinks and yellows over the domes and minarets on the skyline. I've never grown tired of this view. From my first weeks in Istanbul, nearly 13 years ago now, I've always returned to the huge rocks that line the inner city coastline, the perfect place to go with a beer and a friend in the evening. But Istanbul's changed a lot in my time here. The skyline, although timeless, becomes more crowded each year, more harsh-edged luxury towers joining the graceful curves of the bridges and mosques. The city's growing, but the figures on the highway signs at Istanbul's boundaries have never changed. They still have its population at 14 million, as it was in 2013. But that can't be right. People have poured into Istanbul in this past decade, as they have in every decade since the 1950s, when the city's population was less than 1 million. Turks from Anatolia and foreigners from everywhere are drawn to this place that often feels like it's at the centre of the world. Istanbul's municipality has tried to calculate the real population by looking at water usage, but everyone who lives here has their own estimate. 20 million, 25. A taxi driver once told me he thought it was 30 million, although that felt far-fetched, even for Istanbul. The new foreigners have formed nebulous subsets within the city's strata. At the bottom, there are the undocumented, the refugees without papers, mostly from Syria and Afghanistan, hiding out in their homes to avoid the police checkpoints that often spring up in Istanbul's poorer suburbs. Above them are the documented Syrians, many of whom have learnt Turkish to fluency, and above them, the Syrians who have gained Turkish citizenship, a small portion of the millions who came. The Westerners tend to be teachers and journalists, living in the scruffy Bohemian neighbourhoods. There are a few Russians still, who escaped totalitarianism and conscription in Putin's Russia after the invasion of Ukraine began. The Russians were suddenly everywhere in 2022. Cafes in the busiest districts even started writing their boards in Cyrillic. Then they left just as suddenly a couple of years later, when the Turkish government stopped issuing new residency permits to Russians. Then there are the most elusive newcomers, the ultra-rich, who, since 2018, have bought Turkish passports with property investments in the new, Lux-gated suburbs on Istanbul's outskirts. They mostly come from Iran, the Gulf, and other parts of the Middle East, and they live a life apart, gliding from apartments to high-end shopping malls in air-conditioned cars. The rest of us slog it out among the millions. You feel the population growth on the pavements. There's nowhere in central Istanbul where you can walk in a straight line, unimpeded by rush hour or dawdling tourists. Buses and metro carriages are packed. On summer days and national holidays, the public ferries out to the Prince's Islands sit low in the water under the weight of the people packed onto them. And the visitors are rushing in too, in growing numbers since the pandemic restrictions were lifted. There are lines for every museum and palace, and the restaurants are booked out for months. New openings feature in the best magazines, like Monocle, as they should. The city's cuisine is cutting edge, and its top hotels are world class. And yet, at the same time, there's an exodus from Istanbul underway, like a hidden undercurrent against the tide of people coming in. Just months after I moved to Turkey in 2013, the Gezi Park protests erupted, manifesting years of pent-up youth anger against Turkey's increasing Islamisation, its corruption, its rampant constructors, and its Prime Minister, Recep Tayyip Erdogan. The protest lasted for weeks, occupying Istanbul's vast central Taksim Square and showcasing Turkey's millennials as photogenic, articulate, and humorous protagonists. The protests ended when Erdogan sent in the riot police to Taksim en masse, clearing the protesters' tents with tear gas, rubber bullets, and batons, and giving the youth their first taste of state violence. The Gezi arrests began years later, in 2017, after Erdogan had become president, crushed a coup attempt, changed Turkey's constitution, and launched a huge crackdown against any and all of his opponents. By now, Turkey was a changed place. Nobody protested anymore. Many of the people accused of participating in Gezi were now in their late 30s with families. Others, like philanthropist and peace activist Osman Kavala, are decades older and have now been detained for nearly a decade. Hundreds of people have been convicted of attempting to overthrow the constitution and handed full life sentences. Thousands more have fled the country, forming communities of intellectuals, artists and journalists in exile in London, Berlin and elsewhere. And now I'm joining them. The weight of Istanbul's grown too heavy. The economy is in perma-crisis. The city is under constant risk of a catastrophic earthquake. And the arrests and investigations are widening, way beyond political crimes, to illegal gambling and drugs and tax evasion, 3 vices that are not uncommon in Turkey. Top footballers, actors and agents have been arrested, and the message is clear. We can find something on anyone at any time, so keep quiet and don't talk about politics. I never thought that Gezi was a big factor in my decision to stay in Turkey this long, but now I reflect, I realise that it was. It was my glimpse into the Turkey that's both possible and not. The tolerant, creative, youthful force that could take the country into a better future. But this time, at least, it couldn't. Erdogan won, for now. And for the foreseeable future, that other Turkey will live on in the discussion groups and meyhanes of London, where I, too, am heading. But I'm sure that I'll see Istanbul again in better times. And I always know that the sunset over the Bosphorus will stay the same, whatever else has changed. For Monocle, in Istanbul, I'm Hannah Lucinda Smith.
Monocle's Hannah Lucinda Smith there. Well, that's all we've got time for on this week's edition of The Curator. The show was produced by Sam Impey and presented by me, Carlotta Rebello. Join us again next week to hear some of the very best of the programmes across Monocle Radio. Goodbye and thanks for listening.